Hola, I'm Claudia Romo Edelman.
And I'm Cynthia Kleinbaum-Milner.
Welcome to the podcast A la Latina.
The Playbook to Succeed, Being Your Authentic Self.
Today, we have a special guest, Ileana Musa.
She's the head of international banking and lending at Morgan Stanley.
In this episode, you will learn three things. First of all, how Ileana teaches us how to get comfortable talking about money as a way to pave the way to financial independence.
Number 2, how leaning on your Latinidad can make you a master negotiator and influencer.
And number 3, don't be afraid of putting yourself in a position of power as a way to succeed.
This and more in this episode of A la Latina.
Hola, welcome to the podcast A la Latina.
The Playbook to Succeed, Being Your Authentic Self.
Today, an incredible guest, Ileana Musa.
Ileana is the managing director, head of international banking and lending at Morgan Stanley. She sits on the Girl Scouts National Board, on the Corporate Advisory Board of the Association of Latino Professionals for America, on the Florida International University Honors College, and the Cuban Heritage Collection of the University of Miami. She has also been recognized by multiple publications, including the list of top 50 most powerful Latinas in the U.S.
Welcome, Ileana Musa.
Great to be here, Claudia. Nice to be here, Cynthia. I'm super excited about today's conversation.
We are really excited to get deeper into your life, your career, the tips and tricks that you have so that Latinas can succeed in the corporate environment, being their authentic self. And I would like to start with your journey. How did you start being the incredible trailblazer that you are in the financial world? Who was an influence? I've heard stories about your dad being such an influence on your life. So tell us about it.
Sure. Well, my parents were an incredible influence early in life. We had two different paths that eventually converged. I was born in Cuba. My parents made the difficult decisions for my mom to go ahead, and we left to Spain, ended up in the U.S. I was about 3 years old, and my father stayed behind, and the idea was that we would all get reunited. Unfortunately, my father ended up serving a prison term. He was a political prisoner, and I didn't get to reconnect with him until I was 17. And so really those first 17 years of my life were shaped by my mother. I grew up with a single mother of 3 children, getting to a country, not knowing a language, not having anybody else from our family, and starting over. So the first lesson, and I remember at a very young age, was, resiliency and this whole notion of having to pull yourself back up and start over. But doing it in a way that you innovate and you create. So I'm an optimist because I saw my mother of 3 plowed through, have multiple jobs, and yet she was extremely creative and very innovative. And that stuck with me, and it carries through in everything that I do today. And so I always say my childhood was a lesson in R&R. Not relax.
Not rest and recovery.
Not rest and recovery.
Not rest and recovery.
Which are risk-taking and resilience. Okay, that's those are the big themes in terms of my childhood, because seeing this incredible woman that I lost 2.5 years ago go at it over and over again, ask, and not hesitate to ask, taught me at a very young age that it's important to understand your self-worth and to go for it. And so, her favorite phrase was, el no ya lo tienes.
El no ya lo tienes.
El no ya lo tienes.
Exacto.
So whenever I would talk to her about, Mom, I'm thinking about doing X, Y, or Z, she'd say, el no ya lo tienes. Mm-hmm. Go for it. Lean in and do it. Nothing ventured, nothing gained. And so practicing that over and over again, hearing the rejection, but not using it as a deterrence, to go back at it and try it again until you get to the right outcome or a different outcome, because sometimes these paths take you on a winding road to a better outcome. And so all of those experiences shaped me. And then when I was in high school, I met my father.
Let's pause there. That's incredible to start with. And so you met your father when you were in high school, and you were already, el no ya lo tienes, so I'm going to go for the yes.
Yes.
And then what happened?
And so then what happened is my father showed up at high school. I was in cheerleading practice. And the principal came running over and said, Musas, your father's here to see you. And so that was the moment that I walked out and I saw my father for the first time. Because when I left Cuba, I was very, very young. Mm-hmm. And so we started a relationship. He had, again, over a decade in prison finally gets out, finally starts over in a new country, starts his business. He was an entrepreneur at heart. And so we started this new relationship. I spent many days, weeks, months, years getting to know him. And so at a very early in that process, he was very interested in our education. Both of my parents were avid learners, self-taught, and he started asking a lot of questions about college and where was I going to study. And I was thinking about being a dancer at the time. I had been dancing for many years. I was very creative.
You still have the body of a dancer. Let's just say that. Yes.
And so he convinced me. He said, "Why don't you study business, finance, and minor in dance?" And he leaned in, and finally, I had a knack for numbers. I loved it. And then I was observing him, starting a business from the ground up. And we would sit and talk about his business. It was a construction business, but I learned a great deal just hearing the stories and observing him in action. I always say, having role models that we can see in action. I saw my mother in action. I saw my father in action. And then the conversations really influenced me. And so I decided to pursue a degree in finance at the University of Miami. And then from there, he said, keep it going. Go get your master's. Don't deviate. Don't pause. Just go for it. And so he was incredibly supportive and helpful. And so I then obtained my master's in business administration with a concentration in finance at Florida International University. And so when I finished my studies, I had been working full time. I worked full time while I was going to school. And so I was working in real estate sales, and that's, everything I'd learned from my mom about sales, because my mother was a salesperson at heart, really served me well. And so I started to build a clientele in real estate, but then my husband was in the arts. And so we ended up going to Russia for a little bit. His last semester was in Russia. And on the way back, we decided to stay in New York for a little bit. What I thought would be a year, it ended up being 14 years. And so that's when I entered the world of finance. That was sort of the chapter on Wall Street. So when I arrived in New York, I didn't have a network. I didn't have a Rolodex. I had a resume that showed experience in real estate, an advanced degree, and a job in Moscow at a gym teaching aerobics because I was a fitness instructor at the time. And so that was, again, reset, restart. But I managed to find a recruiter that put me in contact with the head of the business at Bank Boston. And that's how I landed my first role in private banking. And,
Incredible.
I like when we started talking about starting the podcast, I always dreamed about having a conversation like this because I thought, how many young Latinas are coming to the U.S. without part of their family? Like, can they, like, are our guests gonna be able to share stories of their lives that really connect? And I'm so appreciative that you are sharing this because I am sure that a lot of the listeners will feel like if they see you, they can become you. And you sharing this is, I think it's gonna make them feel like anything is possible. So I appreciate that.
And it's important to share these stories, and you're creating the platform for us to do that because you're right, you can't be what you can't see, but sometimes people assume when they see you in certain roles doing certain things further along in your career that's where you started.
That's what I assumed about you. I was like,
That's not
she lives in Miami. She probably has these fabulous parents that grew up in Miami and easy life.
Yes.
So it's
and so again, I borrowed a suit for my first interview. I went in. I just took the tool set that I knew I had, which was confidence, work ethic, and the ability to push through. And that's what I sold. And so that door opened. I landed my first job. I learned the business, and that got me on my way. And then those 14 years that I was in New York, I worked for the major firms, the major banks, leading up to my current role at Morgan Stanley. But it was through a series of things that I knew I wanted to do to be able to get to the next level.
And we've heard from others that you have this superpower of influencing and negotiating. Can you talk to us about, like, how does that superpower come to life? And the more you can give us tips, like to-dos, action items for our playbook, the better for our audience.
Sure. So I would say both of those are skills you hone, you develop. They're not innate skills that you're naturally born with. And so there's a couple of things. First of all, it's your track record matters. So before you start to influence or think about how you're going to change, which are really the roles that I assumed over time, where I became a change agent, I became a disruptor. You come in, you have a vision, and you're trying to get others to see that vision, and you're driving change. But before you do that, you have to make your mark. You have to build your brand. And so I made it a point earlier in my career to build a track record. Even though I had aspirations, even though I shared with my bosses all the many things I wanted to do, I delivered results. And so I tell Latinas and women and employees overall, you need to make your mark. And so you need to deliver results and build a track record first and foremost, because that's what's going to help you get noticed. Okay. And so as you make your mark, that means that you're going to use your work ethic. That's certainly what I did. I raised my hand a lot. That's the other thing I would say. And I said yes a lot. Do we have anybody that's willing to do X, Y, or Z? Without having all the answers, without knowing that I was 100% prepared, I would say yes. And then I would go and figure out how I was going to make it work. And sometimes we second guess ourselves.
Totally.
And we first talk about all the different reasons for why something may not work or why may not be prepared. And then we'll say, let me go think about it. I turn that on its head and say yes. And then I go away and I said, what did I just say?
Yeah.
Let me figure out how this is all going to work. And then I go back at it.
And I think that we have heard in the guests that we have here, very similar somehow traits and experiences and also characteristics that are, on the other hand, very different to what we know is true for the Latina community, for Latinas in the community. One is take never, like a point in time as the ending. It's the beginning of the new phase, so you never really stop. You keep on going. The ability to start all over, to start again. Like you move from Moscow to here and you were like, okay, let's do it again. The incredible example from your parents that care about education and that, like support you and give you at least the ethic that you have. And number 4, I think, is the true embracement of your Latina power. As a way to make sure that you're like doing more and taking that hard work to say like, yes, I'll volunteer and so on. Because the reality is that most of Latinos, we have the imposter syndrome. We don't apply to jobs unless we feel that we're 100%, we fit 100%. Men apply when they're like 50%, 60%. Latinas are like under applying. We have that imposter syndrome. We are scared of actually, failing our parents in the aspirations that they have. And therefore, we don't take a lot of risks. And we do have a lot of results. We get results, but we then don't know how to advocate for ourselves and get promotions. And so I want to ask you about your mantra, but before that, so having heard of that and I hope that for our audience is clear that, there's some constants that we're hearing in this podcast of trailblazer women that you need to learn and you need to take. How did you make it to go where you are? What were pivotal moments where you were like, I remember that, between having this promotion and that promotion, I had to do something. And how did you manage actually to get where you are? Telling us a little bit of the maneuvering and the pivotal moments that you had.
So that winding road is to be expected. And so you need to embrace it. I remember moments early on in my career. First of all, let's just talk about Latinidad. My language, my bilingual skills, gave me an immense advantage on Wall Street. When I got to the second bank that I worked, everybody that competed for that role to lead a team, and it was my first time leading, had 10, 15 years on me in terms of experience. And yet I had the language. And so again, when I went in to position myself, I was thinking bigger. I was sharing a vision. I call it visionary leadership, which is, I'm not here to just do the task at hand. I'm painting a picture for what I can do for you longer term as a leader, as a Latina. I'm going to use my language skills. I'm going to help you build marketing content. And so I'm positioning greater value beyond what the job description shows. And so creating a vision, whether you're having a conversation about the role, whether you're talking with your manager, whether you're talking with your partner in terms of what is the big dream, right? What's the big dream? And so being able to talk about that, even if you have doubts about whether that's real or if it's ever going to materialize, is very powerful. I believe in the power of words. I believe in the power of thoughts and in the power of affirmation. And so reminding ourselves and putting those ideas out into the universe and articulating it immediately gives you power, because you are starting to say what will be. And when you say it enough times, you actually start to believe it. And then it translates into your actions, and that portrays in the way you present in a meeting, the way you negotiate, and the way you carry yourself. And so all of those practices, I talk a lot about when I started early in my career, my knees would buckle. I would hyperventilate when I had to present. So
I can't imagine that.
well, I say it a lot of times because many women come up to me and say, how did you do it? And I say, it's a honed skill. It's something that all of us can do, whether it's a negotiation, being able to present, articulating your vision, or going for the bigger job, the bigger opportunity. So some of the defining moments, glad that you asked me about. You work on Wall Street, you work for large firms. There's a lot of mergers, many acquisitions, and so there's constant change. Your ability to navigate and embrace the change is critical. So the big role that you finally obtained and you're leading a large market, all of a sudden comes to an end because there's a restructuring. And then you have a decision to make. Do you start to reflect on why me? Do you start to use that as an opportunity to learn from it? And I call failing forward. How do you fail forward? Which is take that experience, build more muscle, and go back at it in a bigger way. And so that's what I did. The first time that happened to me, about 6 years in, I took a step back. They offered me a lot of different roles, and I said, I'm taking a break. I'm gonna reflect and look at where I've been and where I want to go. I worked with an executive coach, and I spanned the marketplace, and now I could work with recruiters. And so I took the time to focus on me. And I think that's the other thing we need to do. We need to focus on ourselves, and we need to create margins to do that. And the biggest asset for us is time, because we don't have enough time, because we work at work and we work outside of work and we take care of everyone, and we give of ourselves and we stretch ourselves. And sometimes without time, you can't develop yourself.
Totally. And we don't focus ourselves. So you've been talking, and I've been, since I got into the Hispanic market, I've heard your name. And for me, you're associated with influence, network, supporting women, and wealth. I mean, I associate it with a couple of words. And, again and again, I've heard your mantra of taking risks, ask, and using your influence. How is that influencing even your life today? Who taught you that? How would you have used that? I don't know, 20 years ago.
So the influence comes in, again, at a very young age, in spite of everything that we had to go through, right? At a very early age to just get by. There was a philosophy of abundance in my home.
Amazing.
Talk about that a lot. And so my mother was very giving. And so she always made it a point to tell us that there was always room to give to others. There was always room to pay it forward. I remember we used to sit in the dining room table once a month to prepare care packages to send to her family, to my grandmother, my aunt, my cousins. And it was a great time. I have wonderful memories of that. But if you think about doing that over 20 years, every single month, you are maintaining your family in another country, and there's financial strain and there's stress, and yet there's these happy moments about being able to give to others. So, glass half full, I always say, when you get to travel, when you get these experiences and you get to give back to others that are in need, it keeps you grounded. And so I've always been very grounded in the world that I get to operate because of these experiences. And so those experiences is what's allowed me to say, I can use my power for good. And I want to use the talent to create broader impact in the community where I live, in the women that are coming behind me that could get the shortcuts so they can do it in half the time. I always say, what do you want your legacy to be? I want the next generation to do it in half the time. And that's what it is. And in everything that we do, there's an opportunity to give back, to pay it forward, and to have a broader impact. And that's the way I see the world when I operate. And it's a privilege. It's a privilege to be able to do it. And so, I work for Morgan Stanley. It's an incredible organization. It's given me the platform to do what I do in terms of leading the business that I lead day to day, and then also lend my talent to driving the Hispanic Latino strategy, to connect strategically in the marketplace, to be able to do more and collaborate. Because when you create scale, you can do more.
I'm so inspired already.
It's incredible. This is pretty much, I think, that there's always something that triggers, in a way, our desire to help others, isn't it, to giving back. And now listening to your mother having an abundance mentality, when we as a community were grounded in a scarcity mentality, because we have been taught that there's only so few opportunities and that you have to grab them. And so I'm really excited to learn more about like those triggers. Now let's talk about wealth, and why do you think wealth is such an important element? How are you going for financial inclusion? How does that lead to equity? And how are you using your power for, like within Morgan Stanley and everywhere that you touch? Like I've met so many people that pretty much I'm like, oh, so you work for Ileana Musa? No, I work in a different bank. I'm like, oh, okay. So your footprint everywhere.
Yes, it gets to influence, but it starts with the conversation, which is, as Latinas and women, we need to have these conversations about wealth. And traditionally, we shy away from it because we shy away from things we're not comfortable with. And so
you're saying money is not comfortable?
It's not comfortable. When we think about negotiating, one of the big elements there is, what is your relationship with money? Because as Latinos, we didn't grow up, and certainly in my household, talking about money at the dinner table. We didn't talk about wealth. It wasn't a topic that was embraced. We were talking about other things. And when I speak to other Latinas, I think there's very strong cultural norms that don't always serve us well. There's incredible values that give us strength. And then we have to be aware of those blind spots. And I think this is one of those blind spots, which is we need to reflect and say, what is my financial philosophy? Because that financial philosophy will impact, do we believe that we have a choice to negotiate? Because more often than not, I remember when I got my first job in New York City, I was doing the Fred Astaire down Park Avenue because I was so excited that I had steady income, right? And I had a good salary, what I thought was a great salary. It was a good salary. Never it occurred to me to negotiate that first job in New York City. And so sometimes we're so grateful, there's a lot of gratitude, and because we work so hard, that it's a blind spot for us to not lean in and go for more. So first thing I would say, it's a choice. Negotiating is a choice, and we need to make that choice. And so I've become very self-aware over the decades that you need to do it when it doesn't matter so that you're prepared when it does. And that means you're negotiating at home for time, in the way you share the housework, the kids, the family, because sometimes it's a sandwich generation and we are compressed to do more for many more people than just the nuclear family. All of that impacts the way we think about finances. And so the first thing is to reflect on what's our relationship. And then number two, are we on a path to become financially independent? Financial independence is different to financial stability. I see those as two
How do you
different things.
define financial independence?
Financial independence, I define as being able to create a path for yourself where you are building wealth, not just for the near term, for the long term, for the next generation, and to have a financial legacy.
So I want to give some very specific advice to our audience, because you just said something that I didn't understand, just like you, that you could negotiate. And now that I'm on the side of giving people offers, I actually always have a little bit of wiggle room. When you put a job out there, a job description, and people apply, correct me if I'm wrong, you have a budget, but you always have a little bit of wiggle room in that budget. So if you really want a candidate and you're going to give them the offer, you expect them to negotiate. If they don't negotiate, great, you keep the rest of the money. But anyone listening to us, if you guys get an offer, there's nothing bad about negotiating that first offer. Assume that there's a little bit of wiggle room. There's ways to do it respectfully. That's not gonna mean that they're gonna take the offer away, because I think that's the fear, right? Like, what if I negotiate? They're gonna take the offer away. They're not gonna take it away, and you may end up with a little bit more money than you expected. So,
and there's ranges.
Yeah.
And then when you think about what you're negotiating for, there's other things, right? It's not just compensation, right? There's time, there's benefits, there's flex schedules that we're seeing now. So it's thinking about all of it. It's doing the research, investing the time, and being prepared. You need to go in being prepared and knowing what you want, and setting those parameters. Because I always say, knowing what you're going in for is going to anchor the way you think, the way you react, the way you respond. So the way you prepare really matters. Now, that also translates to those same skills help you to influence, to drive change, to accomplish the goals, to secure resources. And so when I think about influence, in essence, it's how do you instill followership? How do you get others to see your vision and to want to get behind what you're doing? Some people would say, well, I use my position, I use my title, I use my power. I would say those are short-lived. They're not sustainable. It takes a lot more work. You have to burn more calories. But if you invest the time to get somebody there on their own, because you are thinking about their goals and what they care about, then when they jump on board and they're in it with you, they're going to stay the course. And that's the ultimate goal in terms of being able to influence, because you're driving change. And so early on in my career, I would go in with the big idea. Here's the idea. Here's a presentation. That doesn't work. What I tell women and Latinas is, first build the relationship. Understand what's important to that individual. And then you land it. Because once you make that connection, chances are they're going to be much more willing to get on board with you and to listen to that big idea. So it's just the sequencing and the order in which you do things that matters.
And I think that also, I think that for this generation of Latinos, we're not used to taking risk when it comes to our salaries and when it comes to our own wealth. And we're very cautious because we have not had, like the family and friends capital that comes to us in the form of wealth and inheritance. So we have to actually start generating wealth. And a number of times, one is because you were saying it's taboo and we don't discuss it as much. But secondly, I think that we're not trained to take risks when it comes to our own wealth building. And if you don't take risks, if you're risk averse, it's going to take longer, which is fine. Which is going to be fine. But I think that given the size of the community, we should, be able to totally start looking at risks with more education so that we can take them in your own life. You're saying take risk, ask, and use your influence and then also for yourself.
Absolutely. And you need to have that plan of how you're going to go about doing it. And that, again, my father taught me that early on. He was an investor. And I was a saver early on when I started working. And he's like, that's not good enough. You have to invest. And he pushed me, the retirement account and maxing out the retirement contribution and these small steps. And he said, if you automatically move the money every month, you're not going to notice it's not there. You have to just build the discipline. And it's about consistency, not a one and done. You don't want to do, a lot of money at the end of the year. You want to just do the drip. Constant, stay the course for many, many years. And this is what I say, right? To your point, you could start, you can earn the income. Then the question is, you're going to save. Are you going to invest? What are the other steps you're going to take? As Latinos, the research shows we save, we don't invest, right? Yeah. Home ownership is big for us. It's the largest asset many of us will own, but you've got to pull on all of those levers.
Yeah. I mean, we're in America. I think maybe in some of our countries, investing in the stock market or having different, a more diversified approach to generating wealth wasn't a thing. But in the U.S., we have the possibility. So
yes, and if you think about many of the countries that we come from, you don't have a lot of stability in the financial system.
Yeah.
So it is definitely very powerful
here and
very different, and we can take advantage of that. I certainly did.
So now we want to talk about the research that you shared with us from the Center for Talent Innovation. You spoke about the results that say that women want 5 things. They want to flourish, to excel, to have meaning and purpose, to empower others while being empowered, and to earn well. And when you think about these 5 things, it's almost like the only way to achieve them is if you are in a position of power. Like if you don't get to a position of power, you can achieve some of these, but the 5 only come if you get to a position of power. So how can we get more Latinas into a position of power?
That was the aha moment of the study. It definitely was for me. And the study is over 5 years old, but it's still, in my mind, very, very relevant. So a couple of things that came out. Number one, the women want the same thing as the men. So that was surprising of the study because they thought that potentially those dimensions that were going to be important to women were going to be different to the men. They were not. Number two, the perception by many women who answered the survey that by going for positions of power, you actually have less choice and less optionality in terms of doing the things you like and want. And it's the opposite.
Yeah.
So what the study calls out is by going for those positions of power, not throwing in the towel, staying the course, you're able to achieve those things that matter most to you. And in turn, you end up having more flexibility for the things that matter to you. And so it's the opposite of what I think most assumed reading the study certainly was for me. And it's universal. I would say these are universal aspirations that sometimes we assume based on gender, we want different things, but we don't. We want a lot of the same things.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think that it's a myth, and it's a myth that we have to bust, and that we have to actually make sure that, like the way that you were talking, that money is not an issue for Latinos, and it's like non-elegant to be able to talk about money, like the same with power and the same with positions of power, where we think that it is easier to be more balanced in your life if you're like lower in the ranks and you're higher in the ranks. And that, I think it's a myth. I don't mean to oversimplify, but I do think that it is something that we should be discussing more. How do we embrace our power? How do we claim power? What does power mean? How do we get there? And how are we going to start looking at it in a different connotation than negative necessarily only? And how are we going to start positioning more and more of all of us? And that's why I think that when I look at you and I think that you've been trying to coin Latinas and wealth, like associate those two words, Latinas with wealth, is because we're not today. And I would love to see more of that success, where we can start looking at how do we make the country realize that Latinas can be wealthy and are on the way to be wealthy. And the same with power, right?
Absolutely. And we are. I mean, if you look at the sheer numbers, 60 million Latinos, over 50% are female, the youngest cohort in the U.S. In terms of numbers, we're there, right? So now the question is, how do we put ourselves on this path to be able to unleash that power? It's like a trapped resource, and we have to unleash it to maximize the benefit. And it also starts with girls. We haven't talked. You talked about being a mom, and that's always the dilemma for us. And we have to get comfortable with trade-offs. Okay, some days, Bella's going to get more of me. Some days work is going to get more of me. I talk a lot with my daughter about what it is to be an executive. I talk to her. Half the things she doesn't understand, but I still talk to her.
Yeah.
She's a Girl Scout. She has her cookie business. I'm teaching her how to sell, how to manage money. I talk to her a lot about savings, investing. All of these concepts. She just turned 11. Probably 30% is sinking in, but over time, 100% will. But I firmly believe we need to start earlier in the process so that next generation is best equipped, has the tool set to be able to lean in and do more sooner.
So that is half the time.
Half the time.
So that is half the time.
Absolutely.
So before going into, I would love to go into the Latina part, into the identity piece. But I just feel compelled to tell you a personal story, so that I hope that we as mothers can talk to our children and can actually feel that sense of freedom in a way to be able to recognize that we do what we can with the tools that we want, that we have in the moment where we are, and it's impossible for us to be able to like be free of guilt of, like working and mothers and so on. But I hope that, like by the time that everybody listens to the podcast, they can go to their children and go like, money, 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 power, 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 power,
Yes.
pride, 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 Latina, Latina, Latina. And so that we can actually embrace it all. So my daughter was turning 6 years old. Now she's 18. And so I used to work for the UN Refugee Agency, and I was like, Tamarita, I love you so, so much. What would you like to have for your birthday? And she was like, I would like to be a refugee. And I'm like, hey, Mommy, why do you say those things? Why would you like to be a refugee? And she was like, I'd like to have you for a full week. And it broke my heart so hard, but because I used to travel, my specialty was war and disaster zones. So even to get to the places where I was working, it took me a week. So I was gone for 20 days in a row, and I was like, oh my God. And every time I came back from Darfur or from Somalia, I used to tell so many stories about these incredible people that were the refugees, that were looking for asylum, that were looking, with dignity, that didn't have anything. And nevertheless, they went forward and starting again and so on. And she had like full admiration for them, but she was also saying, I want to be like them so that you see me, so that you spend time with me. And so it really shook me. And I started thinking like, should I quit? And then I didn't. And then I kept on going to Africa for 20 days. And then when she was 15, I asked her, like, would you ever forgive me for having left you so long? And she was like, what do you mean left me? And I was like, oh, you don't remember?
Yeah.
So at the end of the day, we have to be able to be able to do the things that we need to do, that we want to do, and do it in a way that, is giving us permission to try as hard as we think that our parents will be proud of us, understanding that our kids are going to be the result of our example, the way that you are of your mom or your dad, isn't it?
That's legacy right there.
Yeah.
That's what the next generation is left with, which is those experiences, those conversations, those memories that then carry you forward and allow you to continue in those footsteps, get better. Because I always say the next generation, in these tables, the next generation can have conversations about how much easier it was.
Yeah.
Absolutely. All right, let's get into the Latina.
I want to say something about money. Because
Yes.
I work in also a financial services company.
At Money Lion.
At Money Lion. And we talk a lot about the taboo of speaking about money. And there's this phrase that we all use of money can't buy happiness, right? And the way we see it is it can't buy happiness, but can you be happy if you're worried about money all the time? And the reality of most Americans is that they're worried about money. Even people making hundreds of thousands of dollars, they're worried about money. And I think the other data point is that women manage most of the money, right? They purchasing, it's not just the grocery bills that women manage. It's big purchasing decisions that are managed by women.
And Latinas even more so, yes.
Exactly. So we have to remove the taboo of speaking about money. Why is it that it's so hard to have a conversation about how much money I want to make? How much money do you make? How do I ask for a raise? I remember in my class in business school, we made a pact, my girlfriends, that we would tell each other how much each one was making.
Wow.
And we were going to help each other negotiate when we would get an offer. And that's what we do now. If anybody gets an offer, we talk to each other and we're like, is this a good deal? And people go in the databases of their companies. And we help each other negotiate for jobs. There's no envy. There's really full transparency, so we can rise the tide. So yeah, I can add you to the WhatsApp.
Rise the tide. Thank you. But it starts with the conversation.
Yes.
It starts with the conversation because usually you're sitting around these tables and, I don't know, we can talk about shoes or purses or, when you start talking about real estate and you start talking about net worth and you start talking about investment ideas, this is what it's about. And you don't need to, what I tell a lot of my friends that are not in the business that I'm in, you don't need to be an expert. right? Because the goal around Latinas and wealth is everybody, it's like your driver's license, everybody needs to be equipped to do it. You don't need to be in the industry. You don't need to have a degree in finance to be able to do it. And we have to get comfortable, and then we have to embrace it, knowing that it starts with a conversation.
Yeah. Okay, now let's talk about Latinas.
And
Yes.
let's face it, the reality is that we're talking with trailblazers, but being a Latina is a superpower. We love it. We're focusing on it, but it has been, like an obstacle to the careers of many. It has been a point of rejection. It has been, like the perception of Latinas is absolutely stereotyped. We're underrepresented, we're underpaid, we're undervalued. How have you experienced your Latinidad? Have you had to dial down? Talk more about your identity as a Latina in your career. Is it, because of that, despite of that, where were the moments you were talking before about how to think about it almost like as a suitcase that you get to a trip?
How to flex.
You were succeeding being Latina before it was cool to be Latina in finance in New York, not 20 years ago.
Yes, and again, my childhood memories were we were all in being Latinos at home. Some families got to the U.S. and their goal was to assimilate.
Totally.
In my home, it was all about embracing your Latinidad. And I remember in Miami, we used to drive after school. My mother, when she used to pick us up, there were some signs that would say English only. And she would get very upset and she would say Spanish only. And we'd get home and it was Spanish only from the moment you walked in. And it was like that throughout my entire, and it didn't matter who said what. We were true to our culture, loved the language, spoke the language, and embraced everything about our Latinidad. So when I got to New York, I'm not thinking it's not going to be welcome, you know? But then I started to learn that we needed to, that I needed to adapt. And it wasn't, I would say, anybody that wasn't on Wall Street, not just Latinas, have to learn how to adapt. When you come into a new environment, you need to learn how to adapt. And so the question is, how do you leverage that superpower? We're natural collaborators. I would say one of the things that has given me one of my biggest advantages is the ability to bring others to the table. I think horizontally all the time. So that helps, when you work in a matrix organization, in a large corporation, to be able to say, we're doing on this, but shouldn't we bring in somebody from technology? And shouldn't we bring in somebody from this? And I met this person. And so your ability to collaborate and build relationships helps you in bringing others to that table. And when you bring others to that table, you can think bigger. You can get others on board with that big idea, your vision, and you get less resistance, because you're engaging people early on. And early adoption is what it's about.
Yeah.
When you have a big idea or an idea that's going to disrupt, you need adopters. You need people that are going to see it, who are going to want to rally with you and be your ambassadors. And so being able to bring others to the table, and we do that. We're natural collaborators. We enjoy working in groups. And so that's one thing that really helped me. Number two, communications. I had a manager that came up to me one time and said, you need to be more succinct. You're giving me every last detail of every idea that you have, and you're losing people. I'm forever grateful to her. She didn't sugarcoat it. It was a blind spot for me. Well, I went off and I started to hone that skill. What are the headlines? Start with the big idea and then get into more detail. Because I remember when my daughter was delayed in speaking. I remember when I went to her pediatrician, she said, your problem is you and your husband just talk and talk and talk, and you need to just focus on the one word. Focus on the one word, let her master it, and then go back and have the conversation. And so that's what I've learned in my roles as well. Start with the big ideas, give the outline, no more than 2 to 3 things, and then get into the color. And you start to give a little bit more into each of those 3 big ideas. And so it was the opposite of what I was doing. I was giving a lot of detail, and then my conclusion was the big idea. You got to turn that around.
There's a professor in HBS, Frances Fry. I don't know if you've read her books, but her main book is called Unleash, and she draws a triangle, and she says, people usually have like the triangle facing down, so they start with all the information, and then give you the takeaway.
Yeah.
She's like, we have to flip the triangle because you lose everyone and
Yes.
it makes you look like you have no idea.
Yes.
Like people leave and they're like, I don't know what Ileana was saying. Like,
Yes.
so-
And when you transition from being an individual contributor to leading others to influencing many, there's a big difference here. There's a big shift from I'm going to do what I need to do day to day to I'm going to lead others because I now have a team to I'm going to manage few, but I'm going to influence thousands. That's hard work. So the way you approach, the way you communicate and the way you engage others around those ideas really matters on whether you're going to get that followership, whether you're going to get others to see that big idea and want to come with you on that journey. So you have to hone those skills, and it's not one size fits all. You have to know your audience. Are you selling something? Are you informing? Or are you trying to influence to get buy-in? So you have to understand who's your audience, what is the objective? I always say the pregame is so important. What is my goal going into this meeting? To inform, to connect, to build a relationship, or to get to the desired outcome, which is getting this person to agree that they're going to support me with this idea when we go into the boardroom.
And how do you do it now? Because people always talk about the meeting before the meeting and the meeting after the meeting, which is where the actual conversation and the decisions happen, right? How are you doing that now in this decentralized world where there's little water cooler chat?
Yes. Well, and even, right during COVID, we're all on Zoom meetings. So, but now we're back in the office. Like we're back. And so here's the way I think about it. Number one, who's going to be around that table? And do they know what you're bringing? So chances are they don't. In the majority of the cases, they don't. And so then you think about who are the individuals that can really help lean in with you in terms of having a conversation of what the benefits of what you're going to present. And it's not, if there's 10 people in a meeting, there's maybe 2 to 3, but I do talk to them ahead of time.
You talk to them before the meeting, so then by the time you go to the meeting, almost already have the vote from those people before. Okay, got it.
Well, you have the vote or you have the concern.
Yeah.
And that's what you're trying to get at. You're trying to understand how do you see this? Do you see it like I see it, or do you see it different? In terms of what's important to you, are you aligned with me, or do you have concerns that I'm not seeing? You're trying to unpack that ahead of the conversation so that it's productive.
And you mentioned a couple of, like in a way, just like going into the Latinidad and how what we're trying to do with this podcast is to try to give the playbook and the tools so that you can be yourself, your authentic self. You don't have, because 76% of Latinos have to hide their Latinidad today. That's a large number of people that are pretending to be someone they are not so that they can manage to survive, let alone lead, let alone influence, never, right? Like, because if you're not yourself, if you're acting as someone else, there's no way you can influence or lead anybody. So, talk about that, that suitcase analogy that you have about, like how to being, like your true self and leading, like being your authentic self doesn't mean that you have to, like your suitcase analogy, just.
Yeah, but it's not all or nothing. So it's thinking about the path that you're on. So let's continue with the same example. If you're trying to get your idea, your strategy to be adopted so you can start to execute, so you can secure resources, whatever it is that you're trying to achieve. I give the suitcase analogy because whenever we take a trip, we pack a different suitcase and we're very comfortable doing it. I just went on a Disney cruise, so I'm thinking I'm going to be with Mickey and Minnie. It's going to be very casual.
Let me get my big
ears. Right. So you're packing for that environment and you don't even think twice about it. You just do it. It's still Ileana Musa, but now it's Ileana Musa, the traveler, not Ileana Musa, the mom, and it's not Ileana Musa, the executive. Well, it was the mom, but because I went with my family. But the point is, you don't second guess yourself. You just flex and adapt to that environment, and you bring what's going to allow you to show yourself in the best way possible. The essence is still the same, but you're playing to win. I always say we got to play to win. So when you're going to enter the boardroom, when you're going to enter a corporate setting, a board meeting, again, you're asking yourself, who's around that table, and how do I want to show up?
And what do you pack? But what I do like about this idea, and we've been talking all over, and I love that you bring the flip the pyramid, the triangle. We talk all the time about flipping the script because Latinos, we've been, like acting in a script that is not ours. I don't know who that is, but it's not ours. Our script is that, like so.
The role was written for somebody else, and we just play the part. Yeah.
The script that we should have is what you described. I'm collaborative. I'm able to bring people. Yes. I'm adaptable. I'm able to navigate through change. Instead, the script that we're playing is she's too social or she's too loud. And that really has to be understood as collaborative, not too social or too nice. It's leading as a mother, being able to convene so that when you understand it is not too social, which is the stereotype, but it's collaborative, then you're able to pack it in your suitcase.
Yes, absolutely. I think resilience is the other one. Latinos are incredibly resilient. The stories we've been talking about here, they shape us, they mold us. When you have a setback, you can go back at it because it's something that you're so comfortable with because you've experienced it your entire life.
Yeah.
And so you go through a crisis, then you can navigate that because you know what tough feels like. You do the hard well. And so that's an asset to a company because you need to navigate different market cycles. You need to be able to lean in and stay the course.
Are there any other characteristics of being Latina that you feel like we need to flip the script? I'm asking because one of my favorite things that Claudia has taught me is that it's not on Latinos to change the narrative. It's not on Latinas to ask, like we can't do it alone. Like we can, through the podcast and through all the things that you do, we can educate and inspire Latinas, but if the rest of the population doesn't also change, we're gonna be rowing against the current. So we want the rest of the US, the rest of corporate America, to associate Latino employees with something that's good for business. Are there any things that you can think of any characteristics that you can think of that corporate America sees as a negative characteristic that we should flip the script? It can be familismo, it can be having an accent, anything that comes to mind?
So a couple of thoughts there. The first is our mindset. We're entrepreneurs. I mean, I saw it with both of my parents. I think naturally, even if you work in a corporation, you don't own your own business, having an entrepreneurial mindset really helps. So, because then you are an innovator, you're thinking outside the box, you're challenging the status quo, and that's where innovation happens. Because you're able to bring other folks to the table, and many of those individuals are different to you, because that's very powerful, that's where the big ideas come in. It's not people that think like us. I would say we need to build networks that don't look like us. We naturally collaborate. Everybody does, with people that think like us, sound like us, look like us, because immediately there's a connection. But it's when you create a network with individuals that think differently, that look differently, that grew up on Wall Street, that went to an Ivy League school. These are all the people that I have wanted to connect with because I learned from them, because they've had a very different upbringing, because they bring something different to the table, and because we all win when we go at it together. So one of the things that because we're natural collaborators, we can lean in. And I think sometimes I always say you shy away from what you don't know. And if someone's not comfortable working with a Latino because they never have, you're gonna have a choice to make. Who's gonna lean in first? I always lean in. I always lean in and reach. I call it the give and the get. So I always wanna give before I'm gonna expect anything in return. And that's always worked really, really well for me. Because again, once you lean in, you're gonna find something in common. And once you find something in common, it's a slam dunk. You're on your way because that person immediately is gonna have a connection with you, and then they're gonna be open to hear the ideas, and you're gonna collaborate. And so I would say that's one area that could be very helpful for us.
Love it. We're gonna go on a little time machine to see Ileana at her 30th birthday.
Okay.
What can we give her as advice? Like, what do you wish you knew? So then the next generation does it in half the time.
Okay. So the first thing is savor in the success. We've spent so much time validating success as Latinas, and in my case, as an immigrant. You're trying to push so hard to allow your generation to do more, to do better, to take care of those you care, sometimes you don't pause to smell the flowers. And it's important to savor those moments and realize that while there's so much more to do, we've accomplished a great deal. And so we need to reflect on that and use that to fuel us. I always say we all need a reservoir, right? Because there's some very difficult moments where you need to pull yourself back up. What are you going to tap into? And sometimes reflecting on what you've done and how far you've come and the wins you've had really helps propel you to go back at it. So don't lose sight of the good.
I love that. Okay, so look, this is coming to an end. This has been a wonderful time. I'd like to know, who do you think we should be, like looking at or interviewing to hear from? How do they make it, whether they have claimed their Latinidad before or not?
Yes, and it's so important to bring more of those voices to the table. So congratulations to both of you, because it's incredible what you're doing and creating this platform, this setting to give greater access, because this is about access, right? Amplify the voice of the women that are doing it in a very transparent way, because we need to also talk about the struggles, right? So that people can learn from it and continue to push themselves forward. You talked at the beginning about the most powerful Latina list. I like that list. It's the first list that's ever been created, specifically focused on high-performing Latinas that have made their mark in the industry where they work. And if you scan that roster, you're on it. It's incredible, the level of insights that you gain. And so I always refer to that list in terms of, I consider that a network of mine, one of my networks, in terms of different women at different stages of their career, accomplishing very different milestones in their journeys, and amplifying those voices in this platform would be incredible. And some of those are my colleagues at Morgan Stanley, and so I'm excited to also bring them to this table with both of you.
Okay.
Looking forward. Oh my God, this was amazing.
I got so many insights. I think I'm going to be listening to this podcast over and over again. Thank you.
Ileana Musa.
And this was a podcast
A la Latina.